Good afternoon. My name is Gardner. I make pipelines, various feather systems, complicated VEX snippets for people, and kind of figure out why their scenes aren't working. And sometimes I get to make crowds. I've been using Houdini crowds since its first version, after using Massive on a few jobs prior, and Houdini, let's just say, was a very welcome step up in usability and control. I work for Alt.VFX, an Australian visual effects company that does long-form and short-form work with a particular emphasis on creatures. Not every job we do is a crowd job, but when we do, we make sure the comp department covers it up under layers of Defo and Atmos. I've been recently rebuilding our crowd agents in anticipation of an upcoming feature job and testing it on a few commercials. So today I'm going to talk about creating crowd agents using Houdini as the central hub. Now, I've slept through a lot of demos and tutorials about crowd work, and they usually feature very, very simple agents that are not quite what we would use on a real job. So how do we make lots of little digital friends using Houdini as our primary weapon? What do we want out of this process? We want a large number of unique-looking individuals, enough variation to make the audience believe that the crowd consists of completely unique agents, which is a lie, because we lie for a living. We want believability, the best visual quality we can squeeze through our renderer. Scalability, produce a large number of agents with as little manual intervention as possible. And we want some flexibility, enough to meet any requirements for the job. We need a mixture of ethnicity, age requirements, costuming requirements, props, flags, unicorns, pooping rainbows, that sort of thing. So let's start with reality. We want to use scan data wherever we can, starting with some basis in reality, whatever that is going to help. Getting full body scans of individuals is kind of difficult, but having a library of head scans is a reasonable proposition. You can buy collections online, you can save them from previous jobs or some other totally legal and ethical hosting process. So we take our head scans and we graph them onto a variety of bodies and clone them from there. This gives us a large amount of variance fairly efficiently. Now, while you can make a lovingly detailed digital human, what happens when you have to duplicate it 50,000 times? Instancing, I hear you say, and sometimes that's the answer. But they have to look unique, and they can't have the exact same animation. You're probably going to have to make some compromises somewhere along the line. So let's start with your favorite base mesh, nothing too high res. Currently, I'm using a single unified body mesh, no eyeballs, no mouth bag, simplified ears. The feet don't have toes because they usually get covered up by shoes. We do keep the fingers and hands, as hand poses are very useful for giving a character life. The number of joints in our skeleton can have a big effect on cache sizes and general usability of your setup. More joints means more animated channels, bigger file sizes, longer load times. Mantra's IFD files used to burn out a 4x4 matrix per joint per agent on disk, and they got real ugly at scale. USD thankfully seems to be a little smarter. So twist joints, deformation helper joints, bend bows, 40 joints in the spine, etc., etc. They all have a cost, and it's up to you to determine if the trade-off is worth it. Many of the techniques that we use in an offline rig aren't going to work here, so think of it more as a real-time skeleton where you only have basic skinning available and keep it kind of minimal and always make them do the thriller dance. Body shapes. Now, one starting point for getting some diverse body shape variation is to use a simple range of body mass index or body weights. Choose a range that you wish to use and then create random blend shapes for each agent variant. Now, given the glorious diversity of humanity as a whole, this is a stupidly simple axis along which to slice the diversity pie. In a more sophisticated setup, you'd have a lot more data points to vary your body shapes. Age, for instance, has a big effect on how somebody's body looks. But for something simple, just BMI will kind of sort of do the job. Our body scans come in all sorts of random poses, T poses, A poses, people doing YMCA. So we need a way to change the pose to fit our rig, conform it to our base mesh topology, and then store that as a blend shape so we can mix up the shapes later on. You could do this by hand, but we are in the crowds business, which means that we're going to want a large number of inputs to give us the diversity we need. Plus, we're too pretty for hard work. Instead, we can science it with the help of the topo transfer tool. For those of you unfamiliar with topo transfer, it wraps one mesh around the other, and it's awesome. Sadly, it does not look like this when it's operating. I think it's time for an RFE. The basic topo transfer workflow is to set up some landmark points that correspond to both meshes. You don't have to go very dense unless you have problem areas. The face generally requires more landmark points to ensure that things go where you need them to go. Once that's done, you run the topo transfer SOP. If all goes well, you have your base mesh wrapped around the scan. From there, you can branch out and bake out texture maps. After that, our next step is to get our new body shape into the agent's base pose. The trick here is to first get your skeleton into the pose of your scan so that you can reverse it later, and deforming the mesh with it. Another simple point deform to the agent mesh, deforming the skeleton to the agent mesh. Although for a better result, you can make a tet mesh out of the base mesh first, so there are kind of more volumetric points inside the mesh to deform with. From there, you do a quick and dirty joint capture at the scan pose, and then use the skeleton blend SOP to get back into the rig pose. And now you should have a front of chain blend shape for your agent. You should be able to see, yeah. This isn't an entirely perfect method for getting our our body mesh into the bind pose, but sometimes you get some dicey deformations around areas that change a lot, in this case, the arms. And that can take some manual cleanup or a whole lot of delta mush to hide our sins. But for the most part, it works pretty well. And here this is operating on the CSER research dataset, which is a large academic collection of body scans. As they're all the same topology, the landmarks on one mesh transfer to them all. So this is just batch processing 100 of them or something. You can see the limitations of this method. You lose the limb length differences as the shapes get conformed to the rig. You could keep track of the original limb lengths and apply that down the line, but that's a problem for future me, the sucker. Similarly, with the overall height, it would be simple enough to store the natural height of each shape. This guy is 1.9 meters tall. This other one is 1.6 meters tall, and use that as a base p-scale for our agent setup. And then you'd at least have the agents roughly matching their natural heights that way. And that takes care of the body. What about the head? As mentioned before, we have a large number of head scans at our disposal, and we need to get those into our base mesh topology and make them available for blend shaping. Again, topo transfer to the rescue. If you have a random collection of scans of differing topologies or raw scans, then it can be worthwhile pre-processing them so that your library is of a common topology, which just lets you batch process them. Here we are setting up alignment landmarks on our first scan of our set. Just to pick one, we transfer it to the others. These will be used for rigid alignment of each scan as well as for topo transfer later on. With a little prim UV magic in Vex, we can transfer the landmark points from the first scan onto any of the others in the set. And this is just a little morph here to demonstrate the idea. You can see the points that move according to the mesh. Once we've done that, we can move the head scan into the correct place so that the topo transfer SOP doesn't have to work quite as hard. We just manually place the first scan into the right spot. We're looking to line up the important facial landmarks, eyes, mouth, ears, with that of our agent base mesh. Then we can use the extract transform SOP to get as rigid a possible transform to where the face should be. Because each scan has the landmark points in slightly different places, as each head's different, just copying the transform from scan 1 is going to be wrong. But extract transform SOP gives us a transform that moves the points into position as best it can. So, and as rigid as possible solution. You can see here that it's lining up the face landmarks in more or less the right spot. The rest of the head and neck moves however it needs to move, and we're going to blend those out a little bit later in our setup. Next step's to do a topo transfer on the head area only. We make a masking group of the head and neck, tell topo transfer that these areas are going to be rigid. They'll still move rigidly, but they won't be a complete mess, and we'll correct them later. We set up the landmarks between our scan and our base mesh. We can reuse the landmarks from our ARAP transform or make new ones if you need denser landmarks. Run the topo transfer, jiggle all the controls, try and figure out the right settings, and then give up and reset them back to the defaults. You should have a wrapped face, and after that's done, blend the body below the neck back into its original place. Our head scan is conformed and is now a blend shape. Now, assuming that we've applied a head to a body of a different body mass index, we may now have a head that's too fat or thin to really fit properly. So how do we add or remove some facial fat procedurally so that the head better fits the body? First, we get the displacement between our base shape and our current BMI mesh. All those BMI blend shapes have been lined up so that they are exactly the same on the face except for the fat levels. Paint a mask for the fat deposit areas on the face and neck, and then just simply apply that delta to our head scan. It's a very, very stupidly simple approach, but it helps make the head scan fit in with the body a little bit better. All right, on to texture baking. After getting heads and bodies into a common pose and topology, we can bake some textures into our base mesh UV space. Labs Maps Baker to the rescue here. Might not be the fastest or the flashiest texture baking tool, but after being deeply integrated into our toolset means a lot. Hopefully the new Copernicus stuff will bring faster and better baking. If you wanted to, you could write out some temporary files and call some command line baker via tops. Houdini, of course, means having lots of options. So our first step is to bake the head scan texture onto the base mesh. Now, in this setup, I have a large number of head textures, but the body has a single base texture that's going to be shared among the heads. We want to keep the details of the body texture, but grade it so that it fits the skin tones of the head. And you can see how exactly horribly wrong this is in this animation. So how do we do this? Thanks to the mighty power of COPS, the old, slow, yet very effective one, you could use TOPS to shell out to another compositing app, but let's keep this inside Houdini. To retint the body texture, we need to remove the underlying color while keeping all the details. To do that, we use a classic compositing trick, frequency separation. In this case, just dividing by a blurred copy of the image. This leaves us with the detail and the base color removed. After that, we can take a blurred version of the face texture to give us the overall skin color from the face, multiply the two together, and away we go. So this is just kind of hit step by step. This is our baked head texture. Thankfully, the color gets extrapolated onto the rest of the mesh, even where the head scan does not overlap. And this is a handy thing that we'll use to our advantage. This is the base body diffuse texture for our male agents. Lots of nice texture details that we want to preserve, but we have to replace that face and swing the skin tones around to match. Here we have a simple mask to define where we're going to blend the head texture in. Nothing much to that. And you can see here, if we simply composite the head texture over the body, it doesn't match very well or at all. So to make a new body base tone, the color derived from the head, we just take the head texture and blur the hell out of it. However, due to UV seams, you can't do that 2D space. So apply that to the mesh as a point color, blur that, bake it out to a texture again. Lots of intermediate files in this setup. Here we are sucking the color out of the body texture. If you want to apply a color to a monochrome image, we usually just multiply a color over the top. So to do the opposite process, we divide by the base color. Basically blur the body texture and divide it by that. It sucks out most of the color and preserves the textures well enough for our purposes. And here's the final result. The Not perfect, but a lot better than it was. Now, slapping a Caucasian dude's skin texture onto different heads is horribly naive. Doesn't even begin to cover what happens with real people and their actual skin tones. In a better setup, we'd have more body textures just generally. But more to this point, you'd have body textures that match the target head a little bit better, so at least things feel a little bit more real. Costuming. Back when I was young and innocent, I thought the faces would be the hard part of a crowd. After a few nasty run-ins with reality, it turned out that costuming is in fact the hardest part of the whole mess. Why is that? Costuming can change from job to job, depending on the weather, setting, historical period, the mercurial whims of the director's wife's dog. Imagine a crowd in summer versus winter, or a crowd wearing suits versus farmers. Also, you don't get any efficiencies out of common topology. The model for a collared shirt is very different to that of a t-shirt, so you can't texture your way out of trouble like you can on a face. Clothing also gets hyper-detailed buttons, zippers, belt buckles, shoelaces. And of course, loose-fitting clothes are just about pretty much impossible with simple joint skinning. This usually requires some sort of SIM pipeline, but there is lots of interesting research going on in this space. This is not Houdini. The usual clothing pipeline is Marvelous Designer or some similar program into Houdini. These specialized programs are very good at what they do, highly interactive, and they're almost enjoyable to use. Almost. You could build clothes in Houdini, but that would take a very determined soul, and we have deadlines. One thing I have learned is build outfits, not individual clothes. You can't really make individual clothes and expect them to fit together. You're going to be chasing intersections all day. If you build outfits, you will have clothing that fits together both in an intersection sense as well as making fashion sense. And as a man who dresses almost exclusively in black t-shirts and jeans, I know fashion. Simplify things. No mesh buttons, belt loops, shoelaces, that's kind of Lot Zero stuff. Possibly detail, we would bake into some texture maps. A bonus goal is to have a mesh that could be simulated with minimal intervention if we're redraping for different body shapes or doing post-crowd sim work. Once we pull the clothes onto the agent, we may see skin poking through the clothes, particularly if the resolutions of the meshes are different. This is really, if you start poly-reducing things down, things will poke through. How do we deal with this? Nothing too fancy, we just boolean out the body mesh where the clothes sit over the top. Problem solved. Plus, it will reduce the poly count of your agent, which is always nice. So this particular setup takes a little bit of manual work until I figure out a more sciencey way of doing it. Until then, maximum effort. For each outfit, you basically just draw an outline curve where the body should cut out the mesh. We leave a small overlap between the cloth and the body just in case we end up looking up somebody's sleeve. Mirror fuse, join the curves so that they'll extrude nicely. Pack and name your curves so that you can match them up with the piece of clothing that they belong to. In terms of doing the booleans, this takes place when we are assembling all the agent layers. Pulling the curves, extrude, boolean, boom, done. No more clothing intersections. Fitting the clothes to our body shapes is just a point deform from the original body shape to the new body shape. But you have to be a little bit careful of convexities in the body shapes or they can lead to some ugly deformations, things like the back curving in on a character more or things like that. For bonus points, when fitting to body shape variants, we can run a quick vellum sim to help them sit better on the new body shape. In this example, with the simple point deform, you can see that the clothes bend around the belly, including the underhang, which is not so great. After a quick drape, everything sits just a little bit more natural. Agent hair. Rather than Lego hair with textures splattered onto it, which is not a terrible low-res technique, use hair cards. Hair cards are awesome. They can have a reasonable point count while the textures do the heavy lifting. They have an actual hair-like silhouette, and unlike the Lego hair, never underestimate the importance of silhouette. And you can also buy a bunch of them online, or there's some great tools in a variety of applications to create them. When you're creating head card textures, sometimes they have color built into the diffuse texture. We suck all that out so we can reassign colors per agent in our shot scenes. You can also rebuild the hair cards into actual curves and render them as proper hair without too much effort. This was a quick and dirty attempt to do that while I was drinking a glass of red wine the other night. It didn't take too long. This is just using the carve sop to extract some curves from each card, interpolate those for whatever density you'd like, add some noise or some shaping on top. I think that going from hair cards to curves is far easier than going the other way, so I'll be using this trick in the future. For randomizing hair color after removing any color from your diffuse texture, make yourself some sort of melanin to RGB function. I couldn't be bothered learning it, so I asked ChatGPT. Then you can assign a random melanin color to your agent's hair. Unless you have specific hair colors that you need to hit, then don't. Levels of detail, or how to crash the farm. Depending on our shots, we may want to break our agents into different levels of detail. Consider a close-up shot with a small group of people versus a stadium shot. Obviously, we want the highest quality we can, but at 80,000 agents, we're not likely to come away from the experience unscathed. So we make level of detail versions of our agents. Now, there's allegedly some shape-matching instancing thing built into the USD crowds procedural, but for those of us not in the land of milk and honey that is USD, we still got to make things happen. The basic idea is to make a few versions of your agents with different levels of poly reduction. Swap in the reduced versions when they're small on screen, or there are several billion of them, and away you go. So how do we slice that up? Any which way you like, really. This is my current setup. LOD 0 is the ground truth. Everything is full res, baked down from there. You could export this out for a close-up offline rig if you wanted to. LOD 1, some polygon reduction, would handle most mid-range shots. LOD 2, heavier reduction, still holds some detail, suitable for backgrounds or distant shots. LOD 3, a single wrapped mesh, everything baked into a texture map, really, really simplified, for when you have high agent counts and we can't get too close to them. And of course, LOD 7000, which is colored spheres, which I have actually used on a job when nothing else would work. Spheres and a sine wave. How many agent variants should you make? As many as you can, of course. I've currently settled on about 3 variants of each head, different color and hair for each agent. So I have about 150 unique-ish agents. Seems to work okay from the perspective of build time and agents loading in a reasonable time. Once the agents are laid out and shot, they get further randomization via color attributes that feed into their shaders so that they appear even more unique. So in order to juice some more variation out of our agents, we can randomize the diffuse colors for clothing. This requires us to suck out the base color of the clothes, and then we can multiply the color attribute in the shader. A little bit of hue saturation value-based randomization is nice and intuitive to work with here. If you have very specific outfits that you need to build, sports team shirts, uniforms, demonic clown clothes, then don't do this, just make the textures that you need. Recently, I started using a different workflow for the final assembly of an agent, using a blank template agent and populating another definition from here. Why do I do that? It's a bit cleaner to add things fresh each time, especially in the early stages where you may be adding or removing things from the shape library. It works quite well with having different LODs in different agent definition caches. You take the high-res source one and bake it down into different outputs as you need. Let's presume this is a sane idea. So how do we do that? Start with a very basic source agent definition, which only contains our rig and a simple skinned base mesh. We won't add to this particular agent, but this becomes the basis for our various levels of detail. We create our agent variations, switching heads, BMI variations, costuming and clothes, cache these to some intermediate files. For each agent LOD, load the layer file, do whatever necessary reductions, and load these into the agent layer SOP. Write out to a new agent definition cache, only saving the agent layers. In our animation clip import network, we write out the clips and clip info and copy them into the various agent LOD definitions. So we've written out our finished agents. We're deploying them in our shots. Here's some random observations from bitter experience. We usually have a limited number of mocap cycles to draw upon, but large numbers of agents. Sooner or later, you're going to start noticing agents falling into sync, particularly if it's a large, noticeable action. Things like hand waves are great for this. How do we deal with this? At a basic level, we're trying to randomize clip offsets and random playback speeds, but on a large crowd, the random numbers just ain't random enough. And they usually end up standing right next to each other like these guys, just to mock your pain. This is a wide of that particular shot. You can see the wee buggers syncing up all over the place. Sometimes random just isn't random enough. One particular handy trick is to take another motion clip. In this particular example, I think it was clapping or something. Blend that onto the upper body, if that's your problem area. If you're inside a DOP workflow, there's the agent clip layer DOP that can apply another clip on top of a subset of the skeleton using a transform group. If you're operating in SOPS land, you might just have to make your own with some Vex and a song in your heart. Drop down a wrangle, and we can access all the joint transforms of our agent. Grab the transform group weights, blend the current animation against another animation clip, and this will do wonders for breaking up that pesky animation sync. Finally, faking cloth. If you can't afford a full cloth sim for your agents, and they're still reasonably close up, consider the wrinkle solver. It's awesome. You'll get some vaguely correct looking wrinkle deformations for very, very little cost. It's pretty impressive what that thing can do. I've upgraded my crowd setup to 20.5 just to take advantage of that thing. Well, they say that art is never finished, merely abandoned, and this is not art. So it just runs smack into the wall of a deadline, making a squishy sound. What would I improve in future versions? More human diversity, which means more inputs into the system. This way it's going to look more natural, as well as being more flexible in terms of meeting job requirements. Filtering hair and costume choices so that they make sense for certain agents. Grandma probably shouldn't get a skater costume unless she is in fact a skater girl, and then we should be supportive of her hobbies. Mocap remapping for different agent proportions. Some people have long legs and short bodies. Some people now have narrow shoulders, and that all gets mushed out by animation clips of the same limb lengths. Something machine learning, all hail our machine overlords. Human variation quickly slips into a statistics exercise, so you can see how machine learning approaches could fit well into this sort of thing. And finally, automate the hell out of this so we can all go home on time. And that's everything I am willing to admit to knowing. Thank you for listening. I look forward to this all being made obsolete by some research paper in the next room over in about 5 minutes.
So cool. Any questions? You know you've got one. It's in your brain. Okay.
We got one.
Tell me more about your difficulties with Vellum. Why didn't you go that way?
Look, it's the right tool for the job, but it means unpacking agents, and sometimes that's not the just not the right tool for the job. If they were very hero and like, you know, the front row of a crowd, yeah, no problem. But depending also on the nature of the job, turnaround times and that sort of thing, sometimes a wrinkle solver is just going to be enough to give you some kind of, it feels like cloth. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And I was thinking this also in the context of animation itself, right? Mm-hmm. So animating all this crowd is very difficult, and finding all the right body types and enough variation and all that. But we know Houdini can apply animation from different humans or even different types of creatures to other types very well.
Yes.
So, sorry, and I was thinking also about that in the context of clothes. So if it can do that, perhaps it can be used to take the model of a shirt, for example, or pants, and apply the shape or whatever else you need to some vellum material to leverage the fact that you have the model already to that procedural moving and animation and size. What experience did you have in this sense?
No experience in doing that exactly. I think that one of the future things in my head is kind of machine learning deformation for crowd agents. I think that could be really interesting because they're usually just simple linear skinning or dual quad if you're lucky. And the deformations are fairly basic. So it would be interesting to throw that at some sort of machine learning deformation solver to try and get very, very fast, high quality deformations out of the agent at the other end. And I think that could extrapolate to cloth as well. So it's not a full cloth sim, but it kind of looks and feels and smells a little bit like it, enough to, fool most people most of the time.
I see. Thank you.
Awesome. Very nice presentation, Chris. Thank